Great. Hi. Let's see. So this is what you see here are a juxtaposition. This is the Z80 Pac-Man code. This is basically all the computer code that is Pac-Man, and then that's the climbing gym where I used to go in Brooklyn. And somewhere in between those two systems, between Pac-Man and some guy who can't get up the wall, that's sort of where I live. There are 28 groups at the Media Lab, and maybe 25 of them, let's say, are focused on making the world more efficient in some way. And my group is sort of focused on whatever the opposite of that is, to figure out not what the optimization and efficiency look like, but what imagination and delight can be derived from things, to sort of change the world in a way by changing how we see it. As Joey mentioned, I come from, in part from a games background. This is 1850s. This is the science fiction writer H.G. Wells. He used to play these games on his floor, which is a really weird idea if you think about it. What you see in this is the idea that the entire city could be brought into the living room somehow. The idea that you could compress the world, even in the 19th century, down into one tiny space that you could somehow engage with and play. And for about 10 years, what I've been interested in is what happens when you turn that upside down. When you say, let's instead take the city and use that as something that you play. So about 10 years ago, I started a company with a game designer named Frank Lance. And we sort of just set out to explore this idea, could we rethink what cities are and do, not by how we work there or how we live there, but by how we play there. And so we did a whole bunch of sort of adventures in this. One of them was very directly inspired by a visit to Tokyo about 10 years ago. This was the first time that QR code was used in North America. This is about 10 years ago or so. And it was actually for a game. It was for a game that took place in American cities, but not like a treasure hunt, but like an actual game, thinking about the city in terms of specific territories that could be captured. The way that you capture a territory in this particular game is by moving your game piece into that area. Your game piece, in this case, is about 25-foot high inflatable animal. This is what it looked like to play the game. This is what it looked like. This was a challenge. And this was sort of a big success and opened up a very different way of sort of seeing the world, and a different way of seeing the city, that it could be something other than commercial or residential, but also playful in some way. And that you could change the way that the city works by changing the software. You don't have to change the hardware, the buildings. You could just change how all that gets used. And in a way, we didn't, of course, invent that idea. It was really just the technology allowed certain things to happen. And there were two maps that we always had in front of us. One of them about the possibilities, which comes from the past, and one about sort of the sadness of the contemporary reality. And what comes from the past, this is 1958, and this was a group called the Situationists in France. And they were interested in an idea called psychogeography, which was the idea that somehow the conditions of the city, the physical conditions of the city, had fundamental emotional and psychic effects within the human mind. And that you could begin to kind of hack that in ways that they were sort of starting to explore in the 50s that ultimately led to riots and maybe less interesting things than one would hope. But it was the idea really going back over 50 years of saying the city needs to be something that you play in some way. And then the reality, and this is a map from 2007, and this is Sheffield in England, but it could kind of be any city, almost any city in the world. And what it's mapping is 4 generations of in one family where at 8 years old, how far could a child go? So the great-grandfather in 1919 could walk 6 miles in Sheffield to go fishing. And his son, Jack, as they moved further into the suburbs, was able to walk 1 mile into the woods. And then his daughter, Vicky, was allowed to walk about half a mile. And her son, and I think this is true in almost every city, in almost every country, her son, at this point, in 2014, is allowed to move about 300 yards, about 300 meters on his own. And that transition from a world in which we walk 6 miles to go fishing to walking 300 yards because somehow the world is dangerous represented a challenge for us of how to, if we can't make the world broader, could we make it deeper? Could we provide new ways to understand and engage with the world that you're in? And so we made some of the first games that ever used real-time GPS. This is a 2-player game in New York City, the Sun player and the Moon player. That third one in the center is Papa Bones, who's a ghost, not an actual person. This is what it looked like on the display. Your only move in the game is actually to move. We just tracked your location, and as you move through, you're capturing intersections of streets. The Sun player is a real person. The Moon player is a real person. And as they move, their icons move. But that ghost player doesn't really exist. It's just pixels on the screen. But if he touches you, you die in the game. And what that means is that this is what it looked like to play the game. This is what it looked like to play the game. These are people who were running down the street who were being pursued by something invisible. And this was the world that we wanted to make. A world in which we could bring invisible forces to life and have them somehow in interaction with the world that we live in. This is we're working on this now at the Media Lab. This is a game with the student Greg Bornstein called Case and Molly. This is based on a novel by William Gibson called Neuromancer. This is a 2-player game in which one player can't move. They're totally immobilized. But they can see everything that the other person can see, and they have access to all this information. The other person can move as much as they want, but they have access to no information at all, just a very thin line back to the immobilized player on the left. And this weird tension between somebody who is immobilized but can see everything, and somebody who can go anywhere but knows nothing, is maybe has something to do with contemporary life, maybe. And this idea of really treating the poor ways that we interact as something to celebrate, as something to work with as material, that it's not just a deficiency, that the constraint of that becomes something that we can use as material. The thing about game designers is that constraints are really the material that they work with. Games become more fun with more restrictions in them. And so this becomes the thing that we can sort of play with. As I've sort of begun to think about where these things go, this becomes, in a way, one of the more interesting aspects of it, is how to connect people to people in these new ways that have a very thin line. And so these ways of connecting people to people start in my own work in part from a project that we did in Tokyo about 8 years ago that was using, it was when Purikura was still a popular thing here in Tokyo. I think it's not so popular anymore. But we used these stickers that people were making of their faces and some surplus Israeli surveillance software that was designed to look for the faces of bad guys in the world. And we combined those to make a game that was about putting up your face around Tokyo and photographing the faces that were up. It was this sort of tiny Tokyo of faces that were somehow playing with one another. And this is what it looked like as a visualization of how people became connected through this. They would never meet. They would never become friends. They're not now bound on Facebook in some way. But in some way they touched. here in Tokyo, even if it was just through a phone to a face on a wall, that somehow there's that tiny, tiny new way of connecting actually changes how you see all the faces around you, if it works. And these are some of the types of connections that I'm most interested in. The work that Joey referred to earlier for the Knight Foundation in the United States was some work that we did of building games for cities to figure out how to get those cities to engage with one another in sort of new ways. This was a game that we made for the city of Macon, Georgia, which is a small city in the American South. There's not a lot going on there, and you have two populations who move through it absolutely parallel to each other, like an episode from Star Trek or Ghosts, right? They hardly see each other. And so we built not a game, but a playful experience for them by introducing a new currency. The new currency was called Macon Money, and we didn't distribute the actual currency, we distributed bonds to redeem it, except that each person only got half of the bond and had to find their other half somewhere in the city. So these are two people who had to find each other in order to get their currency that was good within the city. And this was very successful in bringing together people who had no other way to interact, but also no other reason to interact, to begin to understand that, in fact, their parallel worlds were on the same plane in some way. And that was really all it took with people, was a playful framework in order for them to connect. This is, I'll show you a project that we're working on right now at the Media Lab with the Dalai Lama Center as part of MIT that sort of takes this one step further. And the easiest thing is to show you the video. And there is sound on this if you can do it, but don't worry if not. Okay, we'll do it without. Okay. So this is a prototype right now. We have about 100,000 people who are signed up, who are ready to use it when we roll it out. And it really comes from two insights. One is that these little computers that we have in our pocket can know so much about us without having to do anything at all. Just by having it on and by carrying it around, we can learn a lot about your habits. We can learn where you are. We can learn what time you wake up, what time you go to sleep. The types of places that you go reveal a lot about what type of a person you are. And all of that without you having to do anything at all. And that this is used right now to serve advertising or for surveillance. And the question is, could you use that for something else? Could you use that for delight? And the other broad trend is that we have these tools and these technologies that allow us to connect to anybody in the world, but that increasingly the way they get used is to make the world narrower and narrower. That the tools that we've developed have become most proficient in keeping us focused on the people that we already know in some way, which is so contrary to what these tools were supposed to do, in a way. And so 20 Day Stranger says that what we'll do is take all the information that we can gather about you as you go about your life for 20 days, connect you to someone who you will never know, who you will never meet, who is not your friend on Facebook, who is not like you in any way, probably, and say that your lives are going to intertwine, to say that you have access to the habits and ideas and places of somebody else's life, and they have access to yours. And this idea that says that what these tools can do is take you out of your own life for a moment, for 10 minutes out of the day, I think is sort of the deepest unexplored potential in everything that we see. So lastly, what we're doing is sort of thinking about how do you sort of take that further. And I think one way to think about it is to say it's not just about connecting with other humans at all, but really with a broader sense of the planet, a broader sense of the environment around us, to nature itself. And I'll start with an older project from about 7 years ago, which was a game called Shark Runners. This is a game that you play in the browser in which you have a ship and you are looking to have your ship intersect with a shark so that you can dive and study the shark. And it's a very slow game. It will take about 6.5 hours for that ship to travel 100 pixels to the left. And if you sat there and watched that, it would be the most boring video game in the world, which is ambitious to try to make. But so what you would do is you would set your course, hope that you intersect with a shark, and if you do, we would call you and let you know that you have intersected with a shark. You have to go back and do a dive. And the headline of the game, the sort of magic in the game, is that all the ships in the game are controlled by the players, and all the sharks in the game were actually controlled by white sharks in the Pacific Ocean that had GPS transceivers stapled to their dorsal fin. So what you have in the game is a bunch of people who are playing a game with a bunch of sharks who probably don't know that they're playing. And there's that kind of magic that happens, that we saw for the first time there, of something that's real and natural in the world kind of folds into your everyday life. That you get a call in the middle of a business meeting from a shark in the Pacific Ocean. These are the types of connections to the world that I think we're just beginning to unpack. We're just beginning to explore. But there's life much more interesting than sharks, and it lives all around us and inside us. This was a game that we made for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's a card game that is about $700, and you have to send us a vial of your spit. And we would take your spit, and we would take the DNA, we would extract the DNA from that, and we would generate your deck of cards based entirely on your DNA. So this particular player has diminished pain. This person has straighter hair. And these things produce certain advantages and problems within the game. The truth is that some of the decks are better than others, and you have to play whatever you get, like everything else in life. So the idea that a game could be produced out of your DNA was sort of one of the initial thoughts about this. But I think even there, you can go further, in that your DNA is only a narrow idea of who you are. That really, to think about who you are as a human is not just about your genetic material, that you can think about it as broader systems that are interacting in different ways, whether that's bacteria or different types of systems of the body. I'll show you, this is work very much in progress. This is a sculpture that we're making that'll be about maybe about 20 feet wide. And this is some of the beginning sketches that show the 11 systems of the human body: the circulatory system, the skeletal system, the respiratory system, and to actually bring them to life using bacteriological interactions, to actually bring those to life and create a sculpture that does everything that the human body does without having the brain. And to think about what it is to really be human, that it really is, in a way, it may be just the interaction between these 11 discrete systems. And to think about sculpture and art as a way to begin to actually imagine this, because it's so hard to imagine it within your own body. So these are just some initial sketches. These will be glass with live bacteria inside. This is the respiratory system, which is pulling air and water out of the building up top, passing it through the endocrine system, and ultimately the skeletal system, which is excreting cellulose so that the skeleton of the sculpture gets thicker and thicker, and it's a sculpture that grows, that lives in the strictest definition of life, and is also in interaction not only with itself, but with the room that it's in. But what's inside us, the idea of the sort of bacteria inside us and of these systems, in a way, that's the least of it. And this is the last project I'll show, which is we're just starting now. This is a collaboration with Connor, who just spoke, with Symbiota in Toronto, and a group of very talented designers in London who used to work at a company called Berg. When the company in London was working a little while ago, they pioneered the ideas that somehow there's this invisible energy around us. It looks like Wi-Fi, it looks like radio signals, it looks like GPS. And we take it for granted. It just sort of is, it's in the air like oxygen or nitrogen or whatever. But it's not. It actually has its own dynamics and patterns. And they began to build a design language in order to allow us to see that. So this was work that they did that allowed us to begin to see the Wi-Fi signals and the ways that they are affected by the structure of the buildings that they come out of. That it's not abstract. It's not that Wi-Fi just sort of moves out. It has a structure. It just has never been visible to the human eye. And they've done a series of explorations about how to think about this. What if every radio transmitter in the city presented in a visual way the field of energy that it was producing around it? And this is important and interesting work to begin to imagine, not imagine, but to begin to see this invisible world around us. But what they're revealing, I think, isn't nearly as interesting as the other invisible world. The other invisible world looks like biology. It looks like nature. And for perspective, it's this idea that there are 10,000 more microbes inside the human gut than there are humans on the earth. And that the idea that humans are somehow special or at the center of this starts to fall away. And that's just the microbes that are on the inside of us. When you get to the outside, we're outnumbered even in a far greater way. And so the question is, how do we imagine this invisible parallel planet that we're completely dependent upon? And right now, in general, the way that we imagine it is publishing papers in scientific journals, in general. And I think that the opportunity, and this is where we're just starting to think about how to make this real, is to use the kinds of design language that we've just seen with Berg that were used to see Wi-Fi or radio or GPS, and to use the same types of language to allow us to see the invisible world that's around us right now. When everybody leaves here in a couple hours, we will all leave parts of ourselves involuntarily. And somebody would be able to tell, in part, where everybody was from, just from the transition of bacteria that make their way from inside you to the outside, simply by fact of being alive. And the question is, what happens, and it will happen, when the city becomes visible at that level? What happens when we can start to see certain types of bacteriological interactions with the city in ways that we could only have imagined 100 years ago. Macchia amorensis, there in the center, which is released at the very, very beginning of spring. Could we make that visible? Could we know that spring was coming because buildings change color, or because a scent is released into the air? And this is sort of the path that we're going down. It's to say that the work that the situationists were doing in the 1950s, when they talked about how to reinvent the city and how the city determines our psychological sensibility, is sort of, we can start to unlock that in totally new ways. The impulse is as old as cities are, and it's as vital to our survival as cities are. But the ways of expressing this impulse are totally new. And just this idea that the invisible things that are chasing us, or the invisible things that we're moving towards, can now be things that we reveal in the world instead of things that we make. So I'm super excited to see what that's going to be, hopefully here in Tokyo soon. And thanks, everybody, for inviting me to this. It's been an amazing day. Thanks.